So we will talk about organizational communication. This module will essentially build on how we do PR within our NCs and for events. And we'll try to tackle how do we communicate within organizations. So how do we communicate within EYP? How do we communicate within NCs? And how do we kind of structuralize our internal, we'll talk mostly internal, but also external communication to make sure that we are engaging with the publics in the best way that we can. When we talk about organizational communication, we can think about how, what kind of communication areas and priorities does NGO have. Since we are an NGO, we can think about how we want to have relationships with donors and fundraising. So that would be our sponsors. We want to have continued relationships with these sponsors. So the example I gave in the previous module was that EYP Germany has a sponsorship with Canon, right? And I think that's I don't know why I'm fangirling over EYP Germany, but that's a good example because they got Canon as a sponsor for one event, and Canon gave them some cameras to use just for the event. And then what they did is they continued building this relationship with the sponsor. So they said, hey, look, we have 6-7 events a year. Why don't you sponsor all of these? And they built this long-lasting, mutually beneficial relationship that we always talk about. And that's a really important part of organizational communication, is to continue the relationships you have with fundraisers or with sponsors, also donors. So you can also think about, if you're organizing an event now, a really good idea would be if your country had an IS in the last 5 years, reach out to the people who organized that IS and ask them if they still have the contacts to all the sponsors for that IS, because then you can try to see if those sponsors will sponsor you again. You have knowledge networks. So in EYP's case, your knowledge networks can be your experts, the people who come to our events as experts. It can be people in the network who are experienced. Those are your knowledge networks that you can work with. Advocacy, we don't do too much of, but it is still part of our priorities and our areas as an NGO, I guess. Campaigning, again, we don't do too much of because we're a non-political organization, or rather non-partisan, sorry. And the main part that we're discussing and focusing on is obviously brand reputation and identity. A majority of organizational communication is all about internal communication. So internal communication refers to the communication we do within our organization. To define it more specifically, we can say that it's an organization's managed communication system where members are regarded as internal public or stakeholder group. So if you recall, you probably don't, but in the PR module, we talked about how you have publics and stakeholders, and those are the people that you're trying to communicate with and engage with and build mutually beneficial relationships with. In internal communication, those publics and stakeholders are your members. In the case of an NC, it's NC members. And those are the people that are your key publics in this case. So members are important stakeholders because they are the ones who need to contribute and communicate the identity of your project to external stakeholders. If you think about the most basic type of outreach, that's your NC members, your delegates coming to an event, loving it, going and telling their friends, who then come and also try a session out, right? In the most rudimentary sense, that's how we can think about it. And of course, our members are making up pretty much all of our internal communication. And I feel like if you're going to take away anything from this module, it should be, how do we do members branding internally, and how do we best communicate to our NC members? Because organizational and good organizational communication is kind of a ground up thing, where if you are able to have good internal communication, which you then pass on to your members, and you are communicating efficiently with your members, that then leads to more events or even better events, and better events leads to more people coming to your NC and more attention from the greater network or from the external world. So this is kind of the real groundwork of where you want to build your relationships with your members. So, like I said, everyone has a role in the communication that you're doing, and everyone is part of your brand. The reason you think about, I mean, I don't know why you think about these, but for example, Spain, EYP Spain has a very, very, very good members branding, right? They refer to it as La Familia. That is a very strong members branding. I don't think it came up intentionally. No one was like making a strategic communication plan and was like, oh, we're going to call it La Familia so people think we're cool. It was natural, but it is indeed a really strong part of their brand, their members branding, as we would call it. And that comes to what we talked about in the PR module about asymmetrical, two-way asymmetrical relationships. You want to build two-way trusting relationships with your internal publics, again, internal publics being your members in this case, internal publics, with the goal of improving your organization's effectiveness. How we define that is the better you are internally communicating with your members and engaging them means the more effective your organization can be, the better events you can put together, or the more events, whatever your goal is. So to kind of take a step back as to what the purpose of internal communication is that it's all about coordination, right? It's all about having internal coordination in your NC and everyone knowing what's going on, what sessions are happening, what projects are happening, what events are happening, what members events, so to say, and what they can do. So other functions are also to promote, to support major change, to create a sense of community. So that's where La Familia comes in, right? Their internal communication functions are fulfilling a sense of community, so that many EYP Spain members feel so much more connected to their NC because there is this sense of community, there's this sense of La Familia. Similarly, that you're able to communicate a vision and values, a vision of the NC, a vision of our values. Of course, our NC values and vision don't entirely differ from EYP's values. They're always the same values, but their vision may be slightly different, that an NC has a specific vision, let's say for extra outreach that year, right? That's a specific vision. If you communicate that with your members, maybe they will buy into that vision and they will support you in this. Even if they're not board members, if I become passionate that my NC is doing outreach, then maybe I'm going to reach out to my contacts and my knowledge networks to then connect a session with more schools, for example. It could be promoting external advocacy, and it could be retaining members. This is a really big thing for us. I think there are some NCs that do this very well, and there are some NCs that aren't able to do this very well, which is that we almost always have very passionate young people in our events. I've rarely seen like too many people that just don't want to be there at an EYP session. Like if I look at delegates at a session, they're almost always passionate, they're always motivated, they're really cool people. But then I realized a few months after the session or a year after the session, none of these people continued. And this isn't because they're not cool or not interested in EYP. This is often because the NC, the structure is unable to retain them and to encourage them to stay motivated. And motivation is something that we'll talk about after, I guess. Yeah, I'll just jump with communication. So like we said, it's the kind of fabric of organizational culture, and communication is going to happen whether it's managed or not. So it's good to manage it in the sense that even if you don't have an NC Slack, people are going to communicate with each other. So the best thing you can do on an NC level is to create communication structures that work for the members, that are able to engage and communicate with the members reciprocally. Okay. And that, again, is about maintaining those internal conversations, because if your members are constantly talking to each other outside of your events, then that's where you get the ideas, right? That's where you get the friendships, the connections, oh, we should totally HO a session together. That's where those come from usually. And of course, the communication that's essential for your organization, and again, we kind of talked about these, is to find that common purpose, is to share objectives together. So sharing objectives, like I said with the outreach, if you make me passionate about your NC, and I am really motivated to be a member of this NC, and I'm really happy to be a member of this NC, then we can share objectives. then when you tell me that the NC board is now trying to get more outreach and reach more delegates in the east of your country, then I am more motivated to share those objectives with you and help you with those. You can work together with your members. You should work together with your members, and you can engage your members to talk about retaining members by giving them objectives, giving them priorities, and giving them direction. And I think I will definitely focus on this a bit more in a second. Fun fact, 70% of change projects fail due to failure of internal communication. When we say change projects, that is stuff like outreach, that is stuff like, say, more events, or even innovative formats. If there is no good internal communication, not only within the board, but with the members, then big projects, these changes you want to make are not going to happen. They're just not going to implement. So then we talk about motivation, and motivation is something really key to EYP, right? If we were talking about an NGO right now, or if we were talking about a company, this conversation would be entirely different, because in a NGO, most NGOs, you're still getting paid. And in a company, you are there to get paid. But in our case, we're a voluntary based organization, which means all of our kind of drive has to come from our motivation. It has to come from intrinsic motivation. And intrinsic motivation, here's a theory I'd like to share with it, has kind of three components that are based on our individualistic desires for self-determination. That sounds fancier than it is. It's essentially that intrinsic motivation comes from our desires to have a certain level of autonomy, for us to have purpose, and for us to master something. And if you, I mean, you've maybe not heard these words like this before, but these are actually kind of the three most talked about things at a EYP debriefing session, or like personal development forum. You know, if you're doing needs analysis, or you're talking about your objectives for a session, it's usually one of these three things that you're talking about. You're either saying that I want to be in charge of my own media team project, or I want to be in charge of my own portfolio. I want to do the communication for my NC. I want to be in charge of social media for my NC, right? That's the autonomy you're looking for. You may be looking to master something. And I mean, this is always the case in EYP. We're almost always looking to do self-development. The reason you guys are here on a Saturday at 4 p.m. instead of chilling is because you have this intrinsic motivation to master these skills, right? This is the only reason you're here. The only reason not the only reason. One of the reasons I'm here is because I want to be a better trainer. I want to work on my skills. So I have this desire to continually improve myself the same way you guys are. And this is pretty much the foundation of why we're here right now, because none of us are being paid for this. And lastly, purpose. The word we hear all the time in EYP is that we have a drive for a greater reason. We want our NC to be great, or we want our NC to host an IS. We want our event to be the best event of the year. Whatever our purpose is, we always find a purpose in what we do. We should always find a purpose in what we do, and that is the motivation that really drives us. And if we think about how within a board, for example, intrinsic motivation works, this is, by the way, a corporate example, so it's slightly different for us. But essentially, if you think about the leadership performance as the board, they moderate the effects of trust in your NC. And meanwhile, they are the ones creating and supporting organizational culture in your NC. If the NC board is consistently talking about La Familia, they are supporting the organizational culture, right? This is something that not only one term of a board just said and exists, it's a culture. Many of our NCs have existed for decades, right? There's, I couldn't say, but I think EYP Greece has been around since like the very beginning of EYP. It was around in 1989 for sure. Oh yeah, that was it. The first IS of EYP that was held outside of France was in Greece, in Thessaloniki. So you have a culture that has existed since that time, right? And even if it doesn't exist now, or you don't feel it, if you're an NC board member, you can research what EYP Greece has been for these decades and try to bring this into the NCS culture. And of course, these things are working with work engagement. So work engagement is board work, it is events, it is pretty much anything the board has to do, sponsors / money, it is any of these. And through building these, you can get overall job satisfaction. Job satisfaction being that the board is enjoying their term, they are intrinsically motivated to do work for a whole year without getting paid, which is often a struggle that we have, right? Board members not doing work because they're like, well, I have school, I have work, I actually get paid to do stuff. Why should I spend my time and energy doing this and getting into these meetings once a week? Why do I do that? So if you really think about how these things affect us and how we as volunteers work in an organization that's based entirely on our intrinsic motivations, then you can structurally try to tackle these things and try to engage your members in interesting ways. And I think for this, consistent communication, to kind of go back to these, consistent communication is what keeps your members engaged, giving them a sense of purpose, giving them some initiative, giving them events where they can engage with each other and get a sense of purpose, to get autonomy, to self-develop. These things are going to build your organizational culture. So if we think of a board kind of like this, then I really want to move. Okay, doesn't matter. All of these are then feeding into our members, right? So we have our members here. The reason I draw it in such a hierarchical way is because of a flow of communication, right? So you can imagine that the board comes up with a new project. Let's say this is an IS. This goes from the board like this, I guess, to down to members, or it needs to. Or you have a PR project. So you and your PR team came up with a new campaign you're going to do internally. So that means that you not only have to communicate this with the rest of the board, but you also have to communicate this with the members. So there's kind of two different groups you need to communicate this project to. You need the board to get on board, and help you out. And you also need your members to also get on board and support your project, whether that's because you're going to involve them in the project as participants, or because you need organizers, you need people to interview, for example, because it's a PR project. Then you need these people to be engaged with your project. And for them to be engaged, you need to communicate with them consistently. So this is something some NCs do that I think is a really powerful tool, is to have strategy meetings that are open to members, right? Because if we go back to the intrinsic motivation, if you give people a sense of purpose, maybe you've heard this in session visions before, but if you are able to give people ownership, then they can take that ownership and run with it, right? If you're saying, hey, the NC board isn't just going to make decisions and come up with projects and then push it on you, but rather we want you to come and give us your ideas on how we can develop our NC or how we can do new projects, then once they come to that event and give their ideas, they're involved now, right? They have bought into the idea. You have built this mutually beneficial relationship with them. So things like that can really help you engage your members further and really activate them to engage with your internal works as an NC. So that, let's say you're doing an IS and you have a meeting for any member to come and give their opinions on what this IS should be, then by the end of that, if you were to ask all those participants if they're interested in becoming an organizer at this IS, I would say it's very likely that many of them are going to be interested, because now they're kind of invested in this idea. Similarly with the chat and the intranets or social media pages, these are things that you can utilize to have kind of this consistent communication with your members that I think is important to keep them engaged. The reason I kind of wanted to draw this out and think about it is that when we think about our internal communication efforts, I think oftentimes there may be gaps between what the kind of board is working on and what the members are getting. And I feel like there's sometimes a bit of a filter in between these where like the members are treated as if they're school kids and the board is the teachers or something, where like only certain information gets to the members, or the members are only engaged when the board needs something from them, right? Like the board, if the board is only sending newsletters or emails when they need votes or they need, you know, participation at a session, then the members are no longer really caring about those emails. So I would again reiterate the importance of when we talked about PR earlier, the importance of building, I love saying this and writing it, mutually beneficial relationships. It's very much a two-way street when you want to engage your members. So to create such change, we can think about three things that we can do with our members. We want to motivate them, we want to coordinate them, and we want to communicate with them. You can, this is like a sample kind of what you could do, is you can increase urgency. So you can create urgency to call to action. It can be something like, you know, vote by the 7th. You want to build a guiding team. So that can be actually working groups, for example. You may know that the GB has working groups, and it's pretty much, or very much, one of the purposes of these working groups to not only have the members, you know, help the GB in their work, but it's actually in many ways to keep EYPers engaged with international governance of EYP. So it's very much, I think, at least as far as I know, intentional to give ownership and initiative to EYPers around our network to have working groups. And I know many NCs have internal working groups too that can help you engage, give purpose, and give ownership to your members. Getting the vision right, I don't think we need to talk about. Communicate for buy-in, that's what I've been talking about in terms of communicating to your members your new projects, your new ideas, and for them to buy in, as in mentally engage with and be interested in. You want to empower action, again, what I've been talking about, and creating short-term wins is very much about having milestones. So if your long-term idea or your long-term goal is to, let's say, have 200 new members, and you're doing this through a PR campaign, then you may want to celebrate when you already have 100, and that can keep the people you're working with more engaged. This is something I talked about in the previous module, is after you do something, after you spend a whole year working on this PR project or working on your board, the best thing you can do for yourself and for the meaning of your work is going to be to create a report. It's going to be to create an evaluation and report of your work. Because if there is no evaluation and report, then in a few months when you're done with your term and a new board comes in, they don't know what you did. They don't know what you did well. They don't know what you did not so well. And they don't know what else you were going to do. They also don't pick up on projects that were started maybe and didn't go on. So for example, with Media Academy, I've been working on this project for like almost 4 years. And despite the majority of the work taking place over the next few days, I see that the biggest impact I'm going to have isn't by training you guys. I mean, it is, but the biggest impact I can actually have is by writing a extensive report of how this event happened, what worked, what didn't work, and what can happen better in the future. So then in a year, hopefully, if one of you decides to do a Media Academy and you pick up this format and you're working with the international office, and you get a new head trainer, or you yourself as the head organizer are trying to put it together, you can read my report and you can see what we did well, what didn't work so well, and what you can do better. So at every step of your work, I think a really core part of organizational communication is leaving documentation and guides and guidelines for future boards, for future people who will fulfill that position to be able to pick up and work with. Then I will wrap it up with the question of, but what's the product? So you guys kind of mentioned some earlier, some things you can do for organizational communication. This also includes external communication now. So far we focused only on internal, but then of course organizational communication very much means you communicating your organization externally, which the external part we mostly covered in the PR module. But some things you can do are press releases. Sarah had a whole workshop on that. Another thing you can do is one-to-one briefings. So this is what you mentioned with the meetings you have. You can do interviews, you can do articles. For example, one thing that I have a feeling can be done more are case studies. So case studies sounds a bit weird in the context of EYP, but for example, if you're trying to get a new sponsor and you're trying to engage with a new partner, the best thing you can do to illustrate EYP to them isn't telling them what EYP is, but it's by showing them, say you are EYP Germany, then you can tell them that Hamburg IS that took place from this to this date was able to engage 200 people from 40 countries. Then you're not only saying this as you would to a sponsor, but you're actually giving them photos from the event of all of this happening, right? Then you're saying we had, say, 25 sponsors and $1 billion in budget. Then your sponsors are getting a better idea of what you can do, right? So your case study, if you take a case study of an event your NC did, and if there isn't one, then take one of that EYP did, and illustrate through this case study how cool we are. That's going to allow you to communicate your project and more effectively, but more attractively as well to any partners or stakeholders or sponsors you're working with. If you're, instead of saying, oh, we're going to bring together this many people, you're showing them that you brought together this many people, or you're saying, hey, we need this much money. And the first thing they're probably thinking is, what do you need that money for? Then you say, in this event, we had this many sponsors that gave us, this, and this, and we had this much money that we did this, and this with. And then you can illustrate all of those things for them because you have all those products. Similarly, if you are working on a project for your members, then you can tell your members, let's say you want a new head organizers, right? Why don't you just put together the best 4 sessions in your NC and illustrate to them how these sessions led to success stories of these cool members that all of these people know, right? So if you're telling someone our sessions led to Lucas and Polly being the greatest head organizers of all time, and since you all know and love them, they're going to be like, oh yeah, I know Lucas and Polly. They're like kick-ass head organizers. So they came from these sessions. Wow, I should head organize some of these sessions. So you can very much utilize case studies in your favor to illustrate to people the points you're actually trying to make. Press conferences are actually relevant if you're thinking about organizing an event that will be on a larger scale. Then you can very much hold a press conference. How to do a press conference would be a whole other module, so I won't run through it. But essentially, you will call press members relevant to you, and you will have a press release, and you will hold a 30 minutes to an hour kind of short conference to share your event with them, share your ideas with them. Here's more kind of cycle of internal communication. So you guys already mentioned newsletters. You already mentioned briefings and conferences. We don't really do roadshows, but actually roadshows are a thing. By the way, maybe you guys don't know, but EYP France, for example, will go around the country to schools and tell the schools about EYP and share what EYP is to students and teachers there. So that's something that has proven effective for their outreach efforts, and I would recommend looking into it actually. We don't really do awards and competitions in EYP. I personally don't think we should. That is up to you. We do plenty of presentations. We do sponsorships. We blog. I mean, we blog in the sense that we have websites and articles, and we definitely always have social media platforms. So we're already doing many of these things all the time. It's just a matter of doing them more effectively and strategically, in line with kind of the PR stuff we talked about in the morning. And this is just another look at how your organization can communicate its inner workings with external. So, you know, you want to have these channels to, for example, you mentioned internet, right? Or videos. So you want channels for information. You want to have a newsletter. So that's this. You want to have your members understand your events or understand your vision to get them on board, like we talked about. The community we talked extensively about. Two-way communication is what I was mentioning, that you want to have chats, you want to have discussions, discourse. And of course, you want to promote collaboration. So again, collaboration meaning you give ownership, initiative, initiative and purpose. And lastly, again, is to think about how your channels can be used for different purposes. You don't want to post about your members weekend on your social media, probably. Like, you don't want to post about members weekend on Instagram. You can post after the members weekend with the cool photos from the members weekend. But if you're saying, oh, we're having a members weekend to your 600 followers, 100 of which are your members and 500 of which are your sponsors, partners, and other EYPers, it's not the right channel. So you always want to think about how you can use all these different channels you have, like your newsletters, your social media platforms, your Slack or Discord channels, and how each of these can help you for the different purposes you're trying to reach. So it can be outreach, it can be coordination. My handwriting is terrible. Yeah, that word just, yeah, no. Or it can be new events. And with that, I don't think I have anything else unless you guys have questions or anything you want to add. Tell me.
It's not really a questions, but if you said using different platforms, there is the struggle of not getting enough people through, for example, our newsletters or internal communication, as we're more easier to reach them through social media. So should we then, how can we like balance between getting the attention of all of our members and not annoying sponsorships or other followers on our social media platforms?
So it's not actually a matter of annoying the audiences by your posts, but rather you got to think about everything in like the bigger picture, which I think is what we miss sometimes. Is you know, you can think of something in the longer term, but also in the bigger picture, that your social media account doesn't exist only within this temporal space, right? Something you post will exist on that platform for a much longer time. So if you're making a post about a members weekend, that post is no longer going to be relevant in a few weeks or in a few months. When a potential partner comes to your Instagram page and is scrolling through your posts, they're not going to care about the members weekend you had, unless, again, I don't mean members weekend after it happened, but before it happened. I think the best way this is being dealt with by some NCs, and the best long-term plan, is to consider that you need to be consistent and you need to commit, right? If you are committed to only communicating with your members through newsletters and a Slack channel, and everything else goes to social media or your website, let's say, then your members know this, and you are also consistent with this. Because if for example, you have an event, right? And you're looking for organizers and you didn't get enough applications. You sent a newsletter and you sent a message on Slack, you didn't get enough applications. If then you go ahead and open a social media post, then that's also kind of telling your members, hey, you don't need to read the newsletter because you're gonna see it on our social media anyway. You're gonna see it on Instagram anyway. So that they no longer need to care about the newsletter. They no longer need to care about the website. A big part of using your channels with a purpose is not only to utilize that channel to its best ability. That's not the only purpose. It's to make sure that people know that different channels are for different purposes and they know what to expect from those channels and they can depend on those channels. And I think this is something that we can do better on an international level with EYP as well. By having only certain things for only internal people, only in some channels, and other things only in other channels, we separate and we kind of tell our members, if you want this, you go here. If you want that, you go there. But you're not going to get both, if that makes sense.